Orders were at once given to watch every building so that none of the county officers could escape across the river into Dakota. Vanderwaa was one of the parties assigned to watch the chairman of the board, Johnson, and before long Johnson came out of his house and went to the barn where he kept a fast horse and cutter. He then pulled the cutter out and went back into the barn to get his horse, but when he tried to hitch it to the cutter, Vanderwaa and friends quickly unhitched the horse and turned it back into the barn. Then Johnson's hired man tried it, with the same result. Finally, Johnson got on his horse, and putting the spurs to it and lying flat with his head on the side of its neck, came out of the barn on a gallop and escaped and disappeared into the timber and across the river to Eden. While some of the raiders were watching the home so that officers could not flee, Henry Hospers, Anthony Benton, J.W. Greatrex, and Judge Pendleton went from house to house of the county officials to plead their cause. But they were met with refusals and even insulted. As a final resort, Judge Pendleton went to see Rufus Stone, who seemed to be the leader of the Calliope Ring, and told him that Greatrex and Benton were legally elected and that their constituents meant to see them installed into office. And while they were peacefully inclined, he said he would not like to be responsible for what might happen if they were refused. Stone shrugged his shoulders and told Pendleton that no gang of wooden shoe Dutchmen would run the county as long as he had anything to do with it, and then he went into the house and shut the door. When the judge rejoined his clients, he threw up his hands and said, "I can do no more, so I guess it's up to you, boys." After talking it over for a few minutes, they decided to take affairs into their own hands and to ask for the key to the safe. But when they knocked on the door, there was no response. The door remained closed. After knocking again and receiving no response, one of their number kicked out the lower panel in the door so that a person could go through. At that time, there were about 200 men in front of the stone house, and the kicking in of the door brought results. The door was opened, and out came a woman who wore a shawl which she drew up, and a heavy veil that almost concealed her features. Something about her did not look womanish. So someone jerked up her hat and uncovered a man's head, which belonged to Mr. Stone. While the raiders laughed out loud and cried, "You can't fool us that way, Mr. Stone," he turned and disappeared into the house. Again, the outsiders knocked loudly on the door, and out came Mrs. Stone through the hole in the door and wormed her way through the crowd to where Judge Pendleton stood. She implored him to keep the crowd from harming her husband. The judge told her that her husband would not be injured if he gave them the key. Whereupon Mrs. Stone went back into the house through the open door, and after a few minutes handed Isaac Follett what was purported to be the key to the safe. Now, Follett had been an Indian fighter, and he had a commanding presence. He acted as if he welcomed another fight. Before Mrs. Stone could go through that hole in the door, she was grabbed by an impulsive young fellow who did not understand what she intended to do, and her dress was torn, but she was not hurt. This was deplored by the other settlers and raiders, and they apologized to her. Supposing now to have the precious key in their possession, they repaired to the courthouse and tried the key, but it would not unlock the safe, and they again went to the Stone home to get the real key. In the meantime, Stone and his family had escaped to Eden, and no wonder, someone dryly observed. It was hell in Calliope, and across the river was Eden, so why not go there? As the safe could not be opened, the raiders decided on further course. But before they acted, they brought forth their frozen lunch, and firing up the stoves in the courthouse until they were red, they thawed their lunch and made coffee. Finding a barrel of smoked ham and shoulders and bacon in the courthouse, they borrowed frying pans from the citizens and began to fry the meat and found it excellent. At this time, the Sioux County Herald was published in Calliope by L. B. Raymond. The printery was in the attic of the courthouse, and during lunch, some of the raiders mixed up the type in the cases, with the result that the paper had to be published in Sioux City for several weeks. This crude act was condemned by most of the raiders. The Sioux County Herald was the first newspaper published in Sioux County. Some of the raiders acted as if they were going to smash the whole printing outfit, but a Mr. Van Gorkum, who managed the plant, pleaded so ardently that they left it alone. The plant was moved to Orange City soon after the raid. The owner, evidently, gambled on the future. After lunching, the lean-to of the courthouse, in which was the safe, was chopped open with an axe. A sleigh was backed up to the opening into which the safe was tipped. Now, the safe was of rolled steel, 52 inches high, 45 inches wide, and 28 inches thick. It must have been a big job to get it into the sleigh and to transport it on the crusted snow without tipping over, but they did it. The books were taken from all the offices and loaded under the supervision of Henry Hospers and Anthony Benton. After lunching again on the same fare as during the early afternoon, the party made ready to leave. As it was bitterly cold, they took one stove that was full of live coals along. There were many guns in the party, and in carrying those around, they instilled a wholesome fear in the hearts of the ringsters. When the procession with the safe left Calliope, the guns were fired both as a farewell and a warning that retributive actions would be met with stern resistance. The safe and the books were entrusted to Ari Vandermyde and Conrad de Jong, and going through the west branch of the Floyd River, their unshod team could not pull the sleigh with the heavy safe up the bank of the stream. Hastily loading the books on another sleigh, they left the safe with the county funds and the county seal in the bed of the West Branch for the night and drove on to Orange City, where they arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning. The sleigh with the books stopped before a shack used by Henry Hospers as an office. As it was in the small hours of the morning, the raiders were chilled to the bone, and the books were not unloaded, but a guard was stationed to watch them until morning. In addition to this guard, there was another, the big dog of Vandermyde. The dog had been along to Calliope, and in going home rode the same sled with his master and the books from Calliope to Orange City. And while his master stayed with a friend in Orange City that morning, the faithful animal stayed with the books and would not allow anyone to touch them. Even when Henry Hospers and Anthony Benton, who had the books in charge, came to check them out the following morning, the dog stood his ground, and Vandermyde had to be found before the checkers could go on with the work. We hope you've enjoyed the Calliope Raid by Charles L. Dyke. This presentation brought to you by the Dutch American Heritage Museum, Orange City, Iowa.